The Scars of Eden, Chapter 9. Anomalous Art and Secret Messages. Planet Earth, 2020. In a year of social distancing, conspiracies, and lockdowns, our new neighbors have offered us a wonderful and warm moment of respite. Their little boy's birthday has occasioned a beautiful gathering of friends and family to mark the happy day. It is an international event, all regulations safe, which has brought together the cultures of many countries, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya in particular. The party has naturally segregated itself for the moment into three demographics: the women at one end of the room, the kids in the middle, and the men in a loud cluster around the Barbie. Gathered around the fire pit, our conversation among the men has fallen to storytelling. Each culture has its own story of human origins. Both the official religious narratives and the older traditional narratives carried orally through the generations. I have already told you one of the Ghanaian mythologies and two of the Kenyan narratives. Tonight, I am being treated to a telling of an ancestral story curated by the Efik people of Nigeria and southwestern Cameroon. According to the Efik people, humanity's origins relate to the arrival of advanced beings on planet Earth in the long distant past. The story begins when a male and a female entity named a Bassi and a Tai appear in a craft which hovers high above the world, like an island in the starry sky. When a Bassi and a Tai create the first humans, there is no sex. There is no marriage. Every individual human is engineered or cloned on the island in the sky. The level of intelligence of the resultant humans is like that of children, and they live in total dependence on their celestial creators. Their food and medical needs are all provided for directly by the advanced beings. They live on the surface of the earth during the day, but are brought back to the island every evening. In due course, however, the humans develop into a more mature species, capable of looking after themselves, which they proceed to do. A Bassi and a Tai realize that the time has come to release the humans from their enclosed safety to fend for themselves on the earth. Before long, the humans have learned to farm, and they begin to establish themselves as a self-sustaining culture. Once they are satisfied that the humans can live self-sufficiently, a Bassi and a Tai decide to take some well-earned leave from Project Earth. In the absence of their superiors, the humans reproduce, and as the population grows, they migrate further out into the world. After their extended leave of absence, a Bassi and a Tai return to the earth, where they find that humanity has developed into a capable and sovereign species, ruling over their environment and developing a powerful civilization all their own. Far from feeling any sense of pride at the success of their project, a Bassi is positively alarmed. He immediately perceives that his and his partner's controlling position over humanity is imperiled by the humans' rising level of intelligence and their power in numbers. After an emergency conference, a Tai volunteers a solution. Her means of keeping the rulers in power and the humans in subjection is brutal and simple. Devices will be released to spread disease among the humans. Explaining the strategy to her partner, she tells him, "If we distress the humans mentally, make them confused and scared, and if we make them sick physically, then they will be no threat." A Tai strategy echoes the pattern of upgrade, upgrade, downgrade, which repeats in the Genesis, Sumerian, and Mayan explanations of human evolution. A Tai's logic also prefigures the social theories of Thomas Malthus in the 18th century and Charles Darwin of the 19th century, which identified conflict and disease as nature's response to a planet afflicted with too many humans. In the 1980s, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, put fresh words to the theory when Fred Hopfer interviewed him for People magazine. He said, "Human population growth is probably the single most serious long-term threat to survival. We're in for a major disaster if it isn't curbed. Not just for the natural world, but for the human world. The more people there are, the more resources they'll consume, the more pollution they'll create, the more fighting they'll do. If it isn't controlled voluntarily, it will be controlled involuntarily by an increase in disease, starvation, and war." It would appear then that the push and pull of debate over sustainable population levels is as old as humanity itself. It dates to a time when there would have been a tiny number of humans rattling around on the planet, the time of Abasi and Attai in the Efik narrative, the era of the powerful ones of Genesis, and the sky people of the Mesopotamian stories. By all those accounts and more besides, the Sky Council, which our ET colonizers comprised, divided repeatedly over their conflicting agendas for Project Humanity. The divisive issues included: how many humans should there be on the planet? How much understanding should we allow the humans? How healthy do we want the people to be? How long-lived? What access should the humans have to food and medical cures? What access should we allow the humans to technology? What access should we allow the humans to us? All these questions rumble through the ancient narratives with an oddly familiar tone. Our battles in the 21st century over GM food patents versus access to food and food security, corporate versus public access to safe drinking water, medical patents versus access to medication, issues around censorship versus medical and journalistic freedom, access to education, unaccountable corporations versus transparent government, all appear to be contemporary iterations of the old struggles dramatized in our world mythologies. These strange echoes raise the question of whether our world mythologies might be as much about understanding the present as they are about remembering the past. Do these issues recur through the ages simply because these are the kinds of areas that will always be battled over? Or is it that since the first telling of our ancestral narratives, nothing has really changed? By the time we migrate from our animated men's huddle around the Barbie into the main room for singing and birthday cake cutting, our conversation has ranged over a great swath of subjects, from the story of Abasi and Attai to Bill Gates and the World Health Organization, from farmers markets to Monsanto, from the theft of African gold to Prince William berating Africans for having too many children, and doing so in the same year he announced the advent of his third child. Given that our group has gathered from our 4 African nations to celebrate the birth of an African baby, you can imagine that the prince's comments have not gone down well. Though we have not actually solved any of the world's problems by the end of our fire pit conversation, we have at least enjoyed a fun discussion, and it has certainly been interesting to see how widespread and long-standing are these questions concerning the health and empowerment of human beings. In the beginning, our world mythologies put forward a more fundamental explanation as to why these same issues harried and harassed our ancestors. Simply put, it was that our ancestors were governed over by rulers who were not human. It is the fundamental reason that the Sky Council lacked any kind of fellow feeling with the human beings they presided over, and why it was capable of such cynical decisions with regard to the welfare of ordinary human beings. It is why the powerful ones of the Hebrew stories could send their humans out to war against each other so frequently, with little or no regard for the human cost of their squabbles. The template in which earthly government or royalty begins with ET overlords, only to be handed over to human regents at a later stage, repeats in culture after culture, all around the world. It appears in the biblical narrative, Greek, Indian, and Norse mythologies. The Edo people of southern Nigeria and the Yoruba people of western Nigeria recount the same story. They describe humanity's original rulers as superior beings who came from the skies. The Yoruba name for the first great superior is Olodumare. The Edo call him Osanobua, a name which means the Almighty One who lives above the waters. Beginning with his son Ogiso Igodo, the descendants of Osanobua maintained their hegemony over the human race. Their title, Ogiso, means ruler from the sky. At a larger stage, the rulers from the sky hand the reins of power over to human successors who, not being from the sky, carry a different title, Oba, which simply means ruler. In many narratives, the handover of power from ET overlords to human kings occurs peaceably, and happily, this is the case in the Edo and Yoruba telling. In the biblical account, by contrast, the transfer of power from Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh to the people of Israel's first human king is an ugly mess. If any of this is true, if our ancestral narratives are carrying ancient memory, then the implications are far-reaching. Consider for a moment, what would it do to the self-perception of a human race governed over by entities demonstrably superior to themselves? What would it do to humanity's fundamental concepts of leadership for their first experience of it to be modeled by beings with absolutely no fellow feeling for them? It is easy to see how the experience of such cold governance, devoid of any human empathy, would leave a mark in our collective psyche as a species, and establish an unholy template for royal and government power for the ages to come. Of course, the $64,000 question is, how much has changed in the eons since? For instance, President Woodrow Wilson led America through the horrors of the First World War, a slaughter in which 9 million men were deployed against one another as human ammunition. More than a century later, the cold calculations that enabled generals to trade the lives of thousands of men and boys in a horrific bloodbath for the sake of a few meters of French meadow absolutely boggle the human mind. A famous moment early in the war, called the Christmas Truce, is a bittersweet reminder of the insanity of it. On Christmas Day 1914, boys on British and German sides emerged from their trenches to play friendly matches of soccer with each other before returning to their trenches, ready to continue the slaughter the following day. This momentary act of friendship reminds us that the brave working class men and boys, mowed down in their millions on that war's battlefields, were there not because of any argument they had with one another. They were enlisted to kill or be killed because of a clash of European elites, because the political powers of the day considered this kind of slaughter of people to be the most expeditious way to settle a competition for territory. In short, it was a reiteration of the same cold calculations as those of the Sky Council who sent our ancestors to war in the time of our earliest memory. In the aftermath of that horrendous war, President Wilson issued the American people and the people of the world a dark warning concerning certain unaccountable powers. Somebody, something, a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive. In the same vein, in 1961, having led America through the early Cold War, President Eisenhower issued a grave warning to humanity in his farewell speech to the nation. Sounding a disturbing note, Eisenhower warned of the shadowy influence of the military-industrial complex. In that very same year, President Kennedy recorded a speech which sounded a warning to the American people concerning the influence over governments exerted by secret societies. All three presidential warnings hint at a fundamental lack of fellow feeling between humanity at large and the shadowy forces which can manipulate governments and foment wars. When I read these grim words against the backdrop of world mythology, I can't help but wonder, are these problems in human society even more entrenched than we think? Do they really go much further back than we may have ever imagined? Have our mythologies recorded the cynical workings of the Sky Council to help us understand not only how things were in the beginning, but the way things are today? Looking at these dynamics raises a question for humanity at large, namely, what is our place in the great scheme of things? As you may recall, the Mayan story offers us a rather unflattering answer. At the very beginning of the human story it says, those who engineered us accidentally produced a Homo sapien who was too smart to want to labor for others and too powerful to be easily corralled and managed. Our colonizers' chief genetic engineer, Quetzalcoatl, aka Kukulkan, aka Quatsimax, had been tasked by his superiors to make avatars for us to do the work and bring us our food. The only intelligence required of these avatars was the intelligence to work effectively for their superiors. So having overshot the mark, Quetzalcoatl was sent back to his lab to make a final adaptation to turn Homo sapiens Quetzalcoatlists into us. This he did by dialing Homo sapiens down to a level of consciousness in which our perceptual field is limited to the realm of our 5 natural senses. Hey, presto, the perfect workforce. It's a very cynical sounding story, and no mistake. It brings no glory either to the engineers or to their creations. It's hardly the kind of story a people would invent as their nation's glorious history. It also sounds some oddly familiar notes. When I first read the Mayan story, it was easy to see how the argument among the engineers of the Popol Vuh parallels the story of Genesis 3, when read with Elohim translated as powerful ones. It too reveals a conflict among those who engineered us over how intelligent we should be. I also hear a 21st century iteration of this ancient conflict in contemporary conversations about higher education. Do we wish to raise students who can ask questions, challenge orthodoxies, think creatively, and see beyond the present in order to learn and make progress? In 2020, for instance, my friends in Australian education have been lamenting recent legislative changes, which appear to move the goalposts further away from those higher aspirations. There is a new watchword in the 21st century, and it echoes in other countries. Our institutions must produce graduates who are industry ready. As I sit at my desk with the Mayan text open before me, the language of industry ready humans really bothers me. I can't help thinking that it has the timbre of that disturbing phrase in the Popol Vuh, ready to be our avatars, to work for us and bring us our food. It makes me shudder. But if the self-serving engineers of the Popol Vuh sound cynical, it's no less disturbing than the account of things I grew up with in the pages of Genesis. In Genesis 3, the leading powerful one, falsely translated as God, wanted Homo sapiens to remain so unintelligent that we wouldn't even know we were naked. Evidently, this God was no great champion of human education. In that light, why would human beings worship a superior who wanted such a low level of intelligence for us? Yet that is how the story goes. In the biblical Sumerian and Mayan accounts, the ET colonizers all realized the value of framing the people's subjection to them in the religious language of worship. They say, in effect, if we can get the humans thinking that we who rule over them are better than they are and are worthy of their worship, then it is so much easier to get the humans to work for us and bring us our food. The notion of human beings needing to worship or sacrifice to someone or something superior lies in the very bedrock of religious belief and practice. Through the historical dominance of religion in society, the principles of knowing the superiors has taken on the flavor of a virtue. That this should have happened within Christianity is all the more extraordinary given the various teachings that Jesus offered the world, intended to set people free from elitism, leaderism, and subjugation. After all, it was Jesus who said, "Call no one on earth teacher." In other words, do not trust the pronouncements of any authority unquestioningly. He also called, "Call no one on earth leader." You have only one leader, and you are all brothers. Hardly a ringing endorsement of monarchies, presidencies, or oligarchies, or indeed any other hierarchies. In another place, Jesus talked about society's tendency to create pyramids of power and chains of human command with unchangeable leaders at the top, and the people pressed down and powerless at the bottom. He said simply, it must not be so among you. Equally importantly, the Jesus of the Gospels did not set himself up as a master to be worshipped or sacrificed to. For instance, when his followers implied that they would pray to Jesus after his death, he directed them instead to do as he did and engage directly for themselves with the source as they would with their own Father. This is the practice that Jesus modeled. In another place, Jesus told his followers emphatically, "I did not come to be served." Yet somehow Christianity has become oriented around serving Jesus or serving God. Indeed, the main business of many churches is the provision of services in which people can come and worship Jesus, a practice to be found nowhere in the teachings of Jesus himself. A generation later, Jesus' famous follower, the Apostle Paul, mocked the very idea of human beings having to sacrifice to God, saying, "The God who made the cosmos and everything in the cosmos is not served by human hands, as if he had need of anything." It's only logical. If we are using the word God, as the Apostle Paul did, to indicate the cosmic source, then any concept of sacrificial religion goes up in a puff of smoke. However, from the perspective of cynical powers, there is a useful opportunity for the leverage in a human population hardwired to serve superiors. Our most ancient stories survive for a reason. In the time I have spent with some of our oldest ancestral narratives, I have come to an idea of why these stories survive and resurface with such remarkable resilience. In my years of training young pastors from time to time, my most enthusiastic students would ask, "What can I do to develop as a pastor?" Of course, there are many possible answers: courses in psychology, listening skills, pastoral counseling, and clinical therapy. Theological colleges generally offer a menu of such courses as a baseline. My thought is that to develop an understanding of how people tick, one of the best things you can do is read the literary classics. Why? Because if a story has lasted, it can only be because a succession of generations have connected with it, and there will be a reason for that. Clearly, people across a spectrum of times and places have found something relatable in the lives and events of those narratives. In other words, a story will endure if it tells us a recognizable truth about the world we live in. My own reading has led me to believe that there is, in reality, far less fiction in the world than we generally imagine. In fact, it is probably in fiction that we find the greatest freedom to tell the truth. For instance, here is a story we all know, retold and illustrated in countless children's books and anthologies. It was popularized by Hans Christian Andersen in the 19th century. The story tells of some wicked merchants. The audience boos. One day the merchants in question decide to trick a vain king out of some cash. They offer to sell His Majesty a fabric which, they claim, only the very best people can see or feel. To uneducated or morally inferior people, the fabric is virtually invisible. Naturally, the king does not want to appear anything but the best and wisest, so he praises the merchants effusively for the fabric, which of course doesn't exist. When the king tries on a garment made from the invisible fabric, his courtiers wish to impress. Of course, none of the gathered courtiers wants to be exposed as uneducated or morally inferior, so they all heap praise on the king's new non-existent garment with exaggerated oohs and ahs. Nobody wants to be the odd one out. On the occasion of his next royal procession through the city, the king decides to wear his new invisible robes, which he does with great pomp and ceremony. That is, until a humble peasant boy, too innocent to stick to the script, simply believes his own eyes and blurts out the obvious. "Look at the king! He's butt naked!" I have never read this story. In an instant, the taboo is broken, the spell is lifted, and everything is laid bare, so to speak. Version of the Emperor's New Clothes can be found in the literature of the 14th century Spain and the 13th century India, each with a subtly different spin. The story's roots may go even further back to the literary worlds of ancient Greece and ancient Persia. It has survived because, with a pithy humor, it offers the hearer a number of useful life lessons. 1. See with your own eyes and hear with your own ears. 2. Have the confidence to trust your own judgment. 3. Don't be silenced by a fear of power or a desire to cozy up to power. 4. Don't be held back by a desire to fit in with the crowd. And 5. Beware of the influence of wicked merchants, people whose only agenda is money. They are always out to sell something, even if the thing being sold has nothing to it. The story of the Emperor's New Clothes is powerful because it makes these points through the drama and humor of a fiction so simple that even a child can understand it, and it carries a special significance for anyone who identifies with beliefs or experiences outside of the mainstream. The pressure to see only what others in your group are seeing can be intense. For instance, I can relate this to a friend of mine in pastoral ministry whose parishioners have been troubled by various close encounters. When he sounded out his bishop, He was told never to speak of these close encounters again. These phenomena fell outside the shared understanding of the clergy, so although his clergy colleagues are allowed to compare notes on a number of other paranormal phenomena, he has been advised to keep quiet about the disturbing thing his parishioners have been experiencing. Consequently, he will have to work out a pastoral response on his own. Of course, there is also a subtle hint of a warning that my friend may find himself locked down upon a cold shoulder if he does speak up. It's the same dynamic. No one wants to be locked down on as uneducated or inferior, so claims made by the academic consensus can be intimidating even to the most thoughtful and confident of scholars. I have been to the hieroglyphs of Egypt and have seen the carvings and sculptures of Central and South America. I have listened to the tortured debunking of some of ancient Egypt's most anomalous carvings and hieroglyphs, and of the ancient Central American carvings of space helmets and Bluetooths and spacecraft. The academic consensus is that these carvings only look that way. The resemblance is coincidental and meaningless. In other words, don't you see them that way, because the experts don't. There's that same pressure again. It says, better be persuaded or you will look stupid. The same imperative applies when it comes to not naming the obvious in various works of art in the Western tradition which appear to depict flying saucers and other anomalous technology. It is easy to be intimidated into not noticing or not naming these rather conspicuous artifacts. For me, one of the most intriguing examples of an artistic anomaly is an article in woodprint illustration published by a German Broad Street newspaper in 1561. The illustrated article reports an unusual event in the news of the day, a mass sighting of unidentified aerial phenomena over the city of Nuremberg. The illustration depicts a crashed object which has exploded, and an assortment of objects of various shapes navigating the airspace over the city. The report, written up by a local printer, Hans Glaser, described the incident this way. In the morning of April 14, 1561, at daybreak, between 4 and 5 a.m., a dreadful apparition occurred, and was seen in Nuremberg in the city, before the gates and in the country, by many men and women. 2 blood-red semicircular arcs, a round ball of partly dull, partly black, ferrous color. Other balls in large number, about 3 in a line and 4 in a square, also some alone, a few blood-red crosses, between which there were blood-red strips, thicker to the rear and in the front malleable. Among them 2 big rods, and within the small and big rods, more globes. These all started to fly among themselves. The globes flew back and forth among themselves and fought vehemently with each other for over an hour, and when they became fatigued, they all fell down upon the earth as if they all blurred, and they then wasted away on the earth with immense smoke. T.R. Isle von Jacobi. Interestingly, Glaser encourages the reader not to speak of these phenomena with ridicule and discard them to the wind, not because he is proposing an ET explanation, but because he takes the events to be some kind of divine warning. The response, Glaser advises, is for the people to behave. Be good citizens, he says. Be good Christians. People should defer to civic and religious authorities for their safety in such uncertain times. To give him credit, though, Hans Glaser has done posterity a great favor by making a clear distinction between his own interpretation and what was actually seen. All this time later, what then do we do with what was seen? In Bruges, Belgium, you can see a famous tapestry, produced in 1538 and titled Summer's Triumph. The anomaly within this work of art can be seen in the sky. Either the sky is peppered with flying cardinals' hats, or the objects depicted carry a more otherworldly significance. Another anomalous artwork can be found in the church of the Dominican Monastery in Sighisoara, Romania. The church contains a painting which dates to the very early 1500s. It shows what appears to be a flying saucer hovering over a building, possibly the monastery itself, with a beam of light rising from it into the sky. To be clear, the writers and painters I have just mentioned did not invoke the language of craft, airships, or spaceships in their descriptions. Their messages are purely visual. By contrast, the Eastern writers of the ancient Vedic stories had no such qualms. The ancient literature of the Vedas, curated by Hinduism, carry many stories of aerial battles among India's kings of ancient times. The Vedas describe craft called Vimanas, which were part of the royal air forces. We are told they were mercury-fueled vehicles with both aerial and spacefaring capabilities. What is significant in these texts is that there is no obvious "therefore behave" that flows from the Vedic battle stories. And if these descriptive texts are not metaphorical or moral tales, then what exactly are we being shown? While on Indian soil, we traveled to the Raisin district of Madhya Pradesh. In the Posari rock shelters near the village of Sadlapur, archaeologist Dr. Wasim Khan has located an even older Indian reference to anomalous craft and ET phenomena. Etched into the wall of a cave is a glyph, which Dr. Khan dates at approximately 4,000 years old. It depicts a humanoid figure with a large head and large almond-shaped eyes. The figure is standing in front of a saucer-shaped craft, with what looks like a wormhole in the background. Now, someone might say that humanoids, flying saucers, and wormholes are all concepts that were surely unknown to the ancient artists. That may or may not be so, but we can still place ourselves in front of these images, look with our own eyes, and ask, what if the artists have simply drawn what they saw? And if so, what did they see? In 2014, Indian archaeologist J.R. Bhagat brought to the world's attention the rock paintings of Sharama, Chhattisgarh. They appeared to depict a saucer-shaped craft with a tripod landing gear. Nearby stands a suited figure, sporting a helmet with antenna and carrying some kind of probe. Perhaps the most striking element of the Sharama, Chhattisgarh rock paintings is the appearance of figures with elongated heads with narrow chins, wide crowns, and large almond-shaped eyes. To a 21st century eye, it is impossible not to recognize the iconic features of small gray aliens. If this artist was simply painting what he saw, then there is really no question what we are looking at. And J.R. Bhagat is not afraid to name the obvious. He says, the findings suggest that human beings in prehistoric times may have seen or imagined beings from other planets, which still provoke curiosity among people and researchers. What were these ancient artists commemorating for posterity? Were they memorializing something imagined or something that happened? Some equally intriguing etchings can be found in caves in Tassili, Niger, in Algeria's portion of the Sahara. They depict a figure in what resembles a helmeted spacesuit. In the background, a number of saucer-shaped craft perform maneuvers, accompanied by smaller orb-like objects. Again, what does it tell us if the artist simply etched what they saw? At the National Museum of Guatemala, you can visit an entire section devoted to carvings of figures wearing what the modern eye cannot help seeing as helmets and Bluetooths. The conventional explanation is that this is what ancient priests wore for their commemorations and ceremonies. But to my mind, this explanation automatically invites another question. Why? Why does their ceremonial headgear look that way? Who were the wearers trying to resemble? And why did those particular motifs come to symbolize advanced power and higher intelligence? If I allow myself to see with my own eyes and trust my own judgment, then I can perceive that the world's artistic canon has some intriguing stories to tell, stories which may differ to our canon of written text and official histories. For another example, we can look at the Annunciation, a 1648 painting by Italian Renaissance artist Carlo Crivelli. The painting depicts an event from Luke's Gospel, the supernatural conception of Jesus. In the picture, the Virgin Mary is shown wearing some unusual headgear on her forehead. Focused directly onto a crystal in her headgear is a laser beam, projected by a disc-shaped object hovering high in the sky. The object bears a striking resemblance to the craft depicted in the painting found in the church of the Dominican Monastery in Sighisoara, Romania, from the previous century. Suffice it to say, Crivelli's portrayal is nothing like the written account of Luke's Gospel. What then is the artist depicting? And where has this idea come from? Is it a random creative flourish? Or has Crivelli left in plain sight a message for any open-eyed viewer? Is it an alternative explanation of the conception of Jesus? A similar motif can be found in a work of art from 1710 by the Dutch artist Aret de Gelder. His painting records another significant moment in the story of Jesus. It shows Jesus being baptized by his cousin John. Brooding over the scene, high in the sky, is an enormous disc-shaped object which is focusing 4 laser beams onto the bodies of John and Jesus below. Once again, the artist appears to be proposing something other than the familiar biblical version of the story. Is de Gelder offering the viewer an alternative narrative concerning Jesus' special abilities? Of course, the skeptic will say, that's not a spacesuit. It looks just like one, or educated people understand that it's really just a moral tale. Or those who are qualified to comment on this painting understand that this is simply how supernatural events are traditionally depicted, etc. Once again, we are in the realm of the emperor's new clothes. Speaking personally, the first time I saw each one of the anomalous carvings and paintings I have just described to you, I actually thought they were spoofs. In reality, all the artifacts I just mentioned are in the public domain for you to see with your own eyes, interpret for yourself. At this point, you might be wondering how artists like Carlo Crivelli or Aret de Gelder could possibly be the curators of secret or privileged information. Why would an artist have access to a different world of knowledge to the rest of us? To answer that question, think again about those moments in history when, through an invasion, or a coup, or through new legislation, governments have made themselves the arbiters of what is news and what is fake news, what is information and what is disinformation. Think about the moment when Emperor Theodosius added imperial force to Christian orthodoxy and sounded an intimidating warning to any group wishing to argue for a different view. Think about that moment when the Catholic invasion of Central and South America led to the execution of the indigenous priesthoods and the burning or burial of their sacred texts. In such moments of suppression, the banned body of knowledge gets dispatched to 2 places. Firstly, it gets archived in the libraries and vaults of emperors and popes, and so becomes the preserve of political and religious elites. Secondly, it gets hidden and buried for its own protection. For example, the Gnostic Gospels, buried in the caves of the Nag Hammadi Desert. This means that the second group with access to the forbidden knowledge comprises the underground priesthoods and the secret societies who know where the treasure is buried. It is often from this second locus that the world's forbidden knowledge leaks into the world's artistic canon. Sometimes the artists in question are themselves the members of such esoteric societies. Other times, artists may be offered access to artifacts or information to be worked into a painting, a carving, a novel, or a movie script. In this way, forbidden ideas, such as those of the Gnostic Gospels, continue to surface and resurface long after their banning, burning, and burial. There is always someone somewhere keeping the forbidden knowledge alive and leaking it, one idea at a time, back into the public sphere. This is how esoteric messages get passed down through the ages for the eagle-eyed to spot. Just when I think I have got my head around this strange world of encoded art and hidden messages, a conversation with a renowned scientist in Kazakhstan takes the story of secret messages from the past into a whole other dimension. In the next chapter, the senior researcher in astrobiology and astrophysics will point us to 21st century research indicating that esoteric messages have been passed to us not merely from previous generations, but from previous civilizations, from people on other planets, orbiting other stars. That is the end of Chapter 9. Peace and blessings to you all.